Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to another installment of the UC San Diego Emeriti Association's Video Legacy Project, in which we are pioneering the creation of an archive of interviews with retired faculty and staff members who have made a significant impact upon the UCSD campus in some fashion. We hope that this provides uh, a cornucopia of interesting anecdotes and insights into the rich fabric that is our campus, and will be of benefit to emeriti and retirees, family members, current faculty and staff, and students and alumni. So without further ado, let's move ahead. My name is Stephen Adler. I am a professor emeritus from the Department of Theater and Dance and provost emeritus from Earl Warren College. I served as president of the Emeriti Association in 2021-22, and I am currently serving as the editor of our quarterly newsletter, Chronicles. And it's my distinct privilege today to interview a colleague and friend, Professor Emeritus Dr. Rick Boland, from the Division of Gastroenterology in Medicine at the UCSD School of Medicine. And so welcome, Rick. Good to see you.
Thank you.
Via the Zoom portal. And I'll give a very brief sketch of Rick's background. Like me, he is a native of New York, but he grew up a couple of hundred miles away from my home in New York City. He grew up in the southern tier of New York, in Johnson City, which is not that far from Binghamton, but perhaps a world away. I'm not sure. Back in the time in which you grew up, he did his undergraduate work at the University of Notre Dame, and then received his MD from Yale University School of Medicine. He then spent a few years after an internship working as a general medical officer at the Gallup Indian Medical Center in Gallup, New Mexico, and then did a residency in internal medicine for the U.S. Public Health Service hospital in San Francisco, followed by a fellowship in gastroenterology at UC San Francisco School of Medicine, and the subsequent work at the NIH, at UCSD's Cancer Center, at Baylor University School of Medicine, where Rick served as chief of gastroenterology about a decade or so ago. It's a significant career with over 400 articles, as well as co-authored or authored articles, as well as a book about his experience working in the field of colon cancer, and a career at UCSD, which is that's interesting because it was a two-chapter career. Rick was here for several years, and then moved on to Baylor, and then moved back to UCSD about 7 years ago. So we'll hear a little bit about that. And I'm going to let Rick speak and take the mic in a second, but last year, Rick wrote, or earlier this year, Rick wrote a piece for our newsletter Chronicles about his path to working in gastroenterology and specifically on colon cancer. And it's a very personal journey, and I think really fascinating story, Rick. So we'd love to hear about that. And I just want to read a sentence or two from the last paragraph of that piece. And it's this: I went from being a kid who just worshiped his father and wanted to be like him, to a medical student who recognized a horrible disease in his family that no one believed was true, to running from fate, to turning and confronting it. And I'll leave that there because I think that's a tantalizing intro, I hope, to a conversation about that. But let's see what we can tease out about your background, Rick, growing up in Johnson City and your own particular family history and how it led you to down this particular path.
Thank you, Steve. I'll be happy to get into this. So yeah, I was born in 1947, and my father had just come out of the military, and I later learned that he was discharged early from the military because he had colon cancer, and he was like 25. But that was a hidden story that the family didn't talk about for a long time. So I never knew much about it until I was confronted by that. So let me just back up a little bit and tell you a little bit about my dad's side. I'm just not going to talk about my mother's side. I just not that she wasn't important, but it's just that my father had much more direct influence on what happened to me. So his family, he was just a second generation American. He came from a working class family that worked in the iron mills in central Pennsylvania. Um, and he was the 12th of 13 kids. And it turns out that his father died of colon cancer when my dad was like 4 years old or something like that. And his grandfather had died of it too. Nobody talked about this. You know, we'd go to see the family in central Pennsylvania, and there was no discussion about cancer, whatever. It was all the other stuff. There was plenty of things to talk about with all that many brothers and sisters, although they were dying off fairly fast. But in any event, my dad um, he got an athletic scholarship to college. His family didn't they weren't poor, but they didn't have any money with all those kids and the dad dying early. So he got an athletic scholarship to go to college because he was a terrific runner, and then he went to medical school on the GI Bill. And then he came to upstate New York and married my mother. Well, he met my mother in Washington, D.C. when he was in medical school and she was a wave. And then he went to upstate New York to Johnson City to do his internship. And then when he finished his internship, he was sent off to the war. The war was over at this time. He came into Italy. So this was like 46, and then they took him over to Yugoslavia, and he was driving around, and he lost 40 pounds, and he had belly aches. And they said that they thought that he had an ulcer. But he lost so much weight, they sent him back home. My mother picked him up in New York City at some uh, wherever they dropped off the military guys, and they took him up to the hospital where he had been an intern called Wilson Memorial Hospital in Johnson City, and they recognized that he had cancer, and they operated on him. It was a stage 3 colon cancer, and they discharged him from the military. Now, he was one of there were 6 boys in the family, and they were all involved in the war effort too. So he was the last one out. But in any event, he then became a pediatrician in this town, in a little town. We're talking like 12,000 people. He was the only pediatrician who was there. And on Sundays we would go to church with him, and then my siblings and I would go to a couple hospitals and even do house calls with him. So I got to see what he was doing in a way. We didn't go into the houses of the people, but we saw that he was busy. But he always said that this was really important work. And so as I grew up, I just wanted to be like him. I mean, from the time I was like 5 or 6, I always said I wanted to be like my dad. He was the hero. And so you grow up, and various things happen. And so um, I then went to college and then medical school. And when I was leaving for medical school, I gave him a hug, and he said he had a bellyache. And my mother said, yeah, he isn't doing anything about it. So I was at medical school for just a couple of months. My mother called me. She said, you better come home for the winter break a couple days early because your dad's in the hospital. He's going to have surgery. And he had an advanced colon cancer, and he ended up dying of that. So this was I mean, okay, so I'm, 22 years old at this time. It's not like I'm a child, but it was still a pretty tough thing. And so then when I got in touch with cousins, mainly uncles. I had one uncle I was pretty close with, and I put the whole story together. And when you have a big family, you can see a genetic problem, I mean, if it exists there. And ultimately, 10 of the 13 kids died of cancer. And so I put that pedigree together, and then I went to some professors at Yale and said, hey, I think there's a genetic disease. And they said, yeah, there is one that's called familial polyposis. Did they have hundreds of polyps? I said, no, they didn't. I went to these hospitals and looked at the medical records. It wasn't there. And they said, well, there's no such disease. And I said, well, how do you account for this? And they had no explanation. But instead of just saying that I was a jerk, which they were probably thinking, they said, well, if you think there's something here, go out and prove it. So that was put the seed in my head. So I did my thesis, my MD thesis on this, and you couldn't solve a genetic problem in 1970 to 73 when I was there, or 71 to 73 when I was in the thesis time. And so I let it go, and I spoke to a few people. I know that the chief of GI at Yale thought I was a little bit nuts, or maybe just neurotic because my father died or something like that. So I learned not to talk about it. But in my head, I was afraid that I would die early. And I even made some decisions that were kind of like, well, I better get something useful done early in my life because I may not have a later part of my life, which is part of the reason why I joined the Indian Health Service. So that was like a way to go out and get some and do something good, pay it back or pay it ahead or whatever the term is for that. So what happened was I did an internship, and then I was out there. I was a general medical officer, and we had to take care of everything. We had some older, we had some fully trained physicians with us. I was at the referral hospital, so there were 200 beds, and I think there were 50 physicians, and that we were the referral place for all of the reservation that was around there. And what happened was that we got incredible exposure. It'd be like if you got thrown into, if you had to put on a new drama or play every night, for a couple of years. That's what we were doing. We were on call all the time. And after a while, you learn not to bother to call the surgeon in for a minor surgical thing. You could take care of yourself. I was delivering babies. I'd never done that as a medical student. And so it gave me an enormous amount of clinical exposure, and it gave me confidence to go after any kind of a problem. So when I went back into my residency, I was like 2 or 3 years ahead of anybody else who was there because of what I had been through. So it was really a very useful experience. And I did it mainly because, the Native Americans were a group that seemed to be, that we needed to pay something back to for what happened in this country. And so I did that. Anyway, so time goes by, and I end up in a GI fellowship. And that was when it was on my 30th birthday, so I was delayed a little bit in my training because of the couple of I did full training, clinical training, and I had my 2 years in the Indian Health Service. So I'm 30 years old, and I'm sitting in a chair literally on my 30th birthday. And all of a sudden I realized that I had allowed this experience to frighten me and to make me feel like I needed to run away or act like there was nothing going on there, when what I really should do is to try to get the skill set to solve the problem. So anyways, I'm sitting there in the chair. I've already been accepted into the GI fellowship at UCSF, and I decided I was going to become a laboratory scientist in addition to getting my clinical training. So that's what I did. There was no place to solve. There were no genetics labs back then. So I joined the glycoprotein biochemistry lab because the guy who was the head of the lab, a guy named Young Kim, had the second largest colon cancer grant in the country. Somebody mentioned this to me, and I thought, well, that's a place to start. That's a way to learn about colon cancer. So off I go, and I went to that lab, and one of the funny things is that when you get really confident and you've got more clinical experience than anybody else, and then you walk into a basic science laboratory that had like 25 people in it, and within the first day, I realized I was the stupidest guy in the room. I didn't know anything about this field of glycoprotein biochemistry. So anyways, I sat down and just kept my mouth shut and just tried to learn the field. And I got lucky. I had some early findings that got published in major journals. And so there I was, plunking away at glycoprotein biochemistry of colon cancers, which in retrospect was never going to lead me to solving this genetics problem. So because of the early successes, I got recruited from being an assistant professor at UC San Francisco to being an associate professor and division chief at the VA at the University of Michigan, and I was recruited by a guy named Tachi Yamada, who was one of the most spectacular minds I've ever met. And he was really a genius at organizational skills and that guy. He was a good scientist, he was a good clinician, but he was really good at running big organizations. And I was his first lieutenant out there. So it was really kind of cool that early on in my career, it's just 3 years out of my fellowship, I had this really interesting job. So I'm moving my way through, and I'm beginning to realize that glycoprotein biochemistry isn't going to take me where I want to go, but that wouldn't be enough. There was a revolution that I had nothing to do with in genetics, where people were developing these new techniques that allow you to clone and to make a lot of observations about how the genome was organized and to link diseases to certain genes. And I was watching this happen 1986, 87, etc. And I got to know a guy named Andy Feinberg, who was a Howard Hughes investigator at Michigan. And he was, giving me sometimes he would teach me stuff, and other times he said, Boland, get out of here, go down to the library and read a little bit. So anyways, I did a sabbatical with him in 1990, and I was trying to pick up on what other people had done, but using new techniques. So we were trying to figure out what multi-step carcinogenesis was. We knew that cancers were filled with mutations, and that most of them had nothing to do with the disease, and we couldn't know how to sort that out. And so I was looking at these lesions under the microscope, where you could see the earliest stages, normal tissue, the early stages, and the more advanced stages. And I was able to pick little pieces off the slides one by one and analyze them genetically. And so we had to come up with some novel techniques to do that. And it turned out that the thing we first started to use wasn't working. And so Andy said, well, maybe we should look at microsatellites. And I said, what are those? And that was another one of the times when he sent me out of the office and said, go down and read about it. So microsatellite sequences are all throughout our genome. There's like millions, literally millions of them. They're just repetitive sequences. But there are things that you can do with them that will allow you to know if, well, a common event in cancer was to lose a gene. That was a common way because a lot of these genes are have tumor suppressive activity. So we could take a look at these sequences and take a look at the normal tissue, where you'd see two copies of it, because you get one copy from mom and one from dad. And these sequences were such that they tended to be different, that you could distinguish moms from dads. And so we were looking for when these things would get lost. And so I had done thousands and thousands of these microsatellite analyses on colon cancer specimens. Right when I'm in the middle of this, so like in 1993, 3 different groups simultaneously recognized that there were mutations in these microsatellite sequences that occurred in about 15% of colon cancers, and that it was linked to this guy from Johns Hopkins named Bert Vogelstein, found that this was linked to the hereditary form of colon cancer. So suddenly, after not talking about this for a long time, because people were looking at me weird, like, what are you so paranoid about? All of a sudden, here we've got a way to study it, and I'm like way out in front of anybody else in my field, because I've been studying these for a different kind of reason. So it was really, sometimes you plan and you have a hypothesis and you test it, and other times you step in it, and that's what happened. I just lucked on to this technique being the central piece of this disease. Now, in 1984, I had noticed 2 families. One was my own family, and then another one that I took care of when I was a medical student at Yale. And this other family had a story of colon cancer, much like my own family, but there were some differences in the types of tumors that were there. And so I used the term Lynch syndrome. I made up this term Lynch syndrome, and I said it was Lynch syndrome 1 and Lynch syndrome 2. Doesn't matter what it was. That hypothesis was wrong. That's what happens most of the time in science. And nonetheless, the term was out there, and I named it after this guy named Henry Lynch. I named it after this guy named Henry Lynch, who had picked up the ball that had initially been rolled out there in 1913. And then he went back and looked at this family, and he said that there was a hereditary form of cancer that gave you colon cancers and uterine cancers and a few others too. So anyways, from 1984 84 until 1995, 96, nobody used that. Or occasionally people would use the term. But Henry Lynch actually used a different term. He didn't use his own named term. He used, doesn't matter what it was. But in any event, then in 1997, the National Cancer Institute organized a big international conference to come up to look at this process and see what was the relationship between these microsatellite mutations, which they called microsatellite instability, or MSI, and the relationship between that and hereditary cancer, and how would you measure it and all the rest of it. And they asked me to chair the meeting because I had been talking about this stuff for a while. So at that meeting, and then a group in Europe sort of coincidentally did the experiments that showed us exactly how to measure these things and exactly how to make this diagnosis. And so it was really quite a time. And so we voted to call the disease linked. Oh, and meanwhile, along the way, right about that time, 4 genes were found that created, when altered, caused microsatellite instability. And so the whole thing fell together, and we voted to call the disease that was linked to those particular alterations Lynch syndrome. And then since then, you know, it's been quite a trip since then. And then even more interesting, and again, you know, most of these remarkable findings I had nothing to do with, but I was always out there sort of, you know, riding the horse. Some guys, one guy from Japan, one guy from Texas, recognized that when you had microsatellite instability, you created the same mutant proteins over and over again, the same way, which rarely happens in cancer. It's usually random and all over the place. And that the body made an immune response to it. And we saw that the tumors were packed with these immune cells. And but that the people died anyway. And so we figured that had nothing that was, we couldn't explain all of that. But it turned out that the tumor cells were cleverly turning on a process to make the immune cells not able to kill the cancer cells. And this guy from Texas and Japan, these 2 guys, both figured out how to reverse that and to make the tumor cells susceptible to being killed by the lymphocytes. And subsequently, a couple of groups at Johns Hopkins and at Memorial Sloan Kettering have found that you can use this therapy that they called it immune checkpoint therapy to cure these cancers. I mean, sometimes you can now find somebody with an early or mid-stage cancer in the colon or rectum and give them this intravenous therapy, and not even with surgery, the tumors disappear. And sometimes even advanced tumors disappear. So it's been quite a ride. And so another little aside issue is, and this has to do with coming to UCSD. So I came to UCSD in 1995. And a couple of years later, my little sister called me up and she said that her son was interested in medicine and could he come out and see patients with me. I said, I have a better idea. How about if he comes into the lab and we'll show him how to do research? He was a college student at the time at Dartmouth. And so, and Alice was living in Rochester at that time. So everybody was stuck around upstate New York. Anyway, so the idea was I got some lymphocytes, some blood from a cousin of mine who was dying of her gastric cancer, and she had already had a uterine cancer. And we made the cells live forever. I mean, so you could do experiments with them. And that was done at Michigan. But then I brought the cells out with me, and then we pulled them out of the freezer when my nephew Matt came out. And we decided, now that we knew where the genes lived for hereditary colon cancer or for Lynch syndrome, that we would try to, and several labs had tried to find mutations in my cousin's DNA, couldn't find them. And it was an unfindable mutation, whatever it was. So Matt came out and we did some experiments together with Vogelstein and recognized that there was a big deletion in one of these genes that was essentially unfindable using all of the current techniques that were around at that time. So Matt did a series of experiments and he cloned the mutation from my cousin's DNA and made a specific diagnostic test for our family. So I had all these cousins and siblings and nieces and nephews sending their blood to me, and we tested everybody. We found out who had it and who didn't. And then once we found out who had it, and this paper is all about to appear now because we finally had, that was 23 years ago that we did these experiments. Before we had the diagnostic test, there were like 22 people who we knew carried the mutation, and 21 of them died of their cancer. Since then, we've got about 22, 23, something like that, who carry the mutation, and they've, with the exception of 3 people who refused to be tested, my cousins refused to be tested for free and privately. But of all the rest, everybody's alive because we had good surveillance methods that you wouldn't want to do if you didn't carry the mutation. But if you
What was the surveillance methodology?
colonoscopy every year, and the women, once they've had the families that they want to have, would have their uterus and ovaries taken out. But that was usually in their 40s, so that was an acceptable sort of way to go about things compared to cancer. So, anyways, so that work was done at UCSD. I'm very pleased to say.
So what brought you to UCSD the first time? What was
Okay.
the lure?
Yeah, well, what happened was I was out at Michigan. I was happy with things. I had done my sabbatical, and research was coming along well. And so keep in mind, UCSD wasn't even a medical school when I got out of was just barely a medical school when I got out of college. And so there was a guy named Henry Wheeler who was the first division chief, and then he was followed by John Eisenberg, who was here for about 15 years. And then John, after 15 years, he decided to step down. And so they were looking for a replacement division chief. And Steve Wasserman, who was the chairman of medicine, called me up repeatedly, sent me letters, and then called me up and said, well, I'd come out and take a look. Because things were going pretty well for me in the lab at that time. And so I talked with this guy, Yamada, and he said, oh, no, don't go out there. Don't bother with them. So I didn't. And almost a year went by and they hadn't filled the position yet. And so Steve talked me into coming out, and I said, okay, I'll come out in January. And this was like in the middle of November. I said, if you find somebody in the interim, go ahead and offer them the job. That's okay. I'm happy here. So anyways, I drive through a snowstorm in Michigan and came out here with a 70-degree day in January. And I said to my wife, don't worry, I'm just going out there for a little break for a couple of days. And I called her up and said, there's something to be said for living out here. So anyways, they brought me out to replace John. There was nothing special. They just said, we want you to build up the division and the rest of it. And the division had been gradually growing under John. And then so I was supposed to come and take it to the next steps up. Turns out we had some problems. The department ran out of money and the rest of that. And so at that time, there was a guy from Dallas who was very well known in the field, the editor of one of the major textbooks in gastroenterology. And he convinced me to come out to Dallas to have an endowed chair to just do research. And they had people take care of all the other stuff. They said, we don't care if you see patients. I only saw patients with hereditary cancer problems. So I moved there, but my wife never liked it out there. And we didn't sell our house in La Jolla. So anyways, after 11 years of that, my wife talked me into coming back again. So I became an emeritus here. And in the meanwhile, then after I left, the person who followed me was John Carruthers, who's now the vice chancellor. And then he got recruited from being the division chief at UCSD to becoming the chairman of medicine, which would be the next major step up at the University of Michigan. So he went back to Michigan, and then they recruited him back here just a couple of years ago. And then after John, then Bill Sanborn came along, who's probably one of the best known inflammatory bowel disease experts in the country. And he grew the division enormously. And I think he may be the most cited, his articles are cited more than any other gastroenterologist in the world. And then when he went into industry, Rohit Loomba came along to replace him, and he's a liver guy. And under Rohit's leadership, I was just looking this up, the U.S. News and World Report in the 2023-24 report put UCSD's gastroenterology and GI surgery, the clinical ranking in the world was number 18. And in terms of research and education, number 1 in the world. So I mean, the division has really grown, and it's been gratifying to come back here and to see. When I came here initially, I was in the oldest lab building. They called it the Basic Science Building now, and now it's called the Biomedical Sciences Building. And we didn't have a whole lot of space, and the resources were only limited. But now there are new buildings. I mean, the place doesn't look anything like what it did before. It's so spectacular, all the growth that's come along, and the faculty went from like about 10 people to 50 some, and the number of patients seen is like 10 times what it was before, and the amount of research funding has gone way up. So it's really seen some terrific days. Unfortunately, I wasn't the guy who led that charge, but it happened.
But you're a part of you may not have been the leader of that particular charge, but I think it's very difficult to disassemble the very complex model that is an institution and say that, if we removed your participation and your contributions, things might have been very different.
Yeah.
How much patient care were you involved in when you were here or at Baylor?
When I was here initially, from 95 to 2003, I was doing general gastroenterology. So I was seeing patients. I had a clinic. Everybody was doing general GI back then. And so I was doing procedures, colonoscopies, upper endoscopy, the usual things that everybody does. What's happened subsequently is people have become much more narrowly focused clinically. So we have like a group that just see patients with liver disease, the hepatology group. We have people who are experts in advanced endoscopy, so they're the endoscopy experts. We also have groups that are experts in esophageal motility, which is not a lethal kind of problem, but it's a very common and annoying thing to every time you swallow to have things get stuck in your throat. So we've got a couple of people. In fact, the first recruit that I got was a guy named Ravi Middle, and he was at the University of Virginia at the time. And there was a guy who had been our esophageal guy, and he was going to retire. And he said, we really need to have an esophageal expert. And I asked several people, and they said he was the best esophageal physiologist in the world. We got him to come out here. So that was pretty good. And subsequently, they've grown that group too. So there are several groups that have come. And so these people, so now if somebody comes into your clinic and they've got inflammatory bowel disease, you send them to one of the IBD experts, or if they've got esophageal disease, to one of them. So that was not happening before. And we just didn't have enough people. We didn't have the resources to do that. Also, for a lot of these entities, there really weren't very good therapies, but now there are. And if you take a look at what's happened to the hereditary, the microsatellite instability colon cancers, I mean, that's spectacular. To go from a disease that my dad might have been able to survive if if he was around 50 years later, but didn't work out that way. So interestingly, there's been a huge growth in our ability to treat these things like metabolic liver disease, esophageal disorders, cancers of all sorts. And also people can do these advanced endoscopic procedures and take early stage tumors out without an operation. That's pretty important.
Oh, I would imagine so. And that's different from ablation?
No, that ablation, well, depends on what you mean by ablation. Sometimes we used to burn things. We'd say we were going to ablate a polyp by burning it, but now you can put a wire around them, and then take the whole thing out and analyze it under the microscope to make sure that there's nothing left. So those procedures have really come a long way.
Oh, I'm sure. Watching from the sidelines, as a member of the UCSD community and not in health sciences, but as a patient of the UCSD health sciences, just having been here for so many years and watching the evolution of the School of Medicine and of health sciences from a patient perspective, it's been astounding. When I got here in 1987, there was Hillcrest, and there were the trailers on Osler, just off of Osler
Yeah.
Lane on the campus. And then soon, then there was Perlman, and Perlman begat Thornton, and Thornton begat, and it's biblical in the way
Yeah.
that they've grown and developed just from uh, a physical perspective. So one has to, step back and understand that the amount of research and the number of discoveries that are coming out of UCSD are, growing, uh, multiplying geometrically as these buildings are being populated. And
I was out here for a glycoprotein meeting that was at the La Jolla. There was a hotel. What is it? The hotel that's right off, just off the campus there. It's changed hands a few times. There were a couple of restaurants and all the rest of that. Anyways,
oh yes, yes.
yeah. So anyways, maybe it was a Hilton or whatever. So the meeting was in that building, and I went for a jog in the morning. This was 1993, and I came across they had broken ground, and they were working on Thornton. And I asked people, what are they building there? And nobody knew at the meeting. There weren't people from UCSD who were here. They probably knew, but this was a brand new building. And so when I came out a couple of years later, here was this brand new hospital, the Thornton Hospital. Now there's a giant hospital next to it. That's impressive. I mean, the population's gone up, but I think what's happened is that UCSD has been able to attract a lot of patients because of the expertise that's here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Friends ask me, uh, what's one of the things that's, as emeritus, as somebody who's retired, uh, one could live in many different places. And I said, I don't want to leave UCSD healthcare behind,
Right.
because you don't get this level of expertise, and it's a deep and broad bench, and so that's really really impressive. Um, so tell me a little bit about your teaching work while you were here. What were there joys in teaching? I come from the general campus where teaching is an important component of the professorial life. And how was it for you as a professor in the School of Medicine?
Well, I always liked teaching. For one thing, when you taught, I had to teach internal medicine and gastroenterology, so that was really pretty broad. And a lot of the faculty who were highly focused researchers didn't like doing that because it made them uncomfortable to have to discuss things that they hadn't really kept up on. Because of my prior experience having an extra 2 years between my internship and first year of my residency, because I had those extra years, I always felt more comfortable with it. And I really enjoyed teaching quite a bit. As time went by, I noticed that my talking would get more and more into the molecular biology of cancer. And I recognized, I mean, it wasn't because people always had that, but you'd see the patients, then you'd sit down with the medical students and the residents, and you'd talk about something in more depth. And I figured, look, everybody's going to talk about what they know, and why shouldn't I talk about something where I can give them more insight than if I'm trying to tell them about how to, what's going on with cardiovascular disease or something like that. So I always enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And then once I left UCSD in January of 2003, went out to Baylor in Dallas. Then I stopped doing. I never did any more teaching rounds for the medical students or whatever. But I would give lectures, a lot of lectures for the uh, for the cancer center and medical grand rounds and that kind of stuff. And they would always be focused on the areas that I knew, and the areas that I knew better than anyone. I mean, in a way, everybody can say that they have something that they know a little bit more about than maybe anybody else. And so I've always enjoyed that. I mean, when I walk up on the stage to give a talk, my mouth isn't dry and I'm not nervous. I'm rubbing my hands together and say, let's go for this. That's the way I've always seen teaching. It's like, I really liked being able to tell people about things that I thought that they should know about, and I thought that it would make them feel good to extend the boundaries of their knowledge.
Have especially since retirement, when did you pull the plug on the career? When did you retire?
Yeah, well, essentially last year. I mean, when I came back in 2016, I was an emeritus, so I've done teaching. I mean, I'm still writing half a dozen papers a year. I don't run a laboratory anymore. I get invited to go various places. I just got two invitations for 2025. I'm going to be the keynote speaker at a Lynch syndrome conference at the University of Pennsylvania, and I've been invited to Cornell, which is in Cornell Medical School, which is in New York City.
Right.
uh, and um, and I'm going to give two lectures there. So I'm still on the map. I don't know how long that will continue. Probably not that much longer. They'll eventually figure it out that the younger guys have to know this stuff, or the women have to know this better than I do. So a little bit longer.
Are you involved in any School of Medicine or medical adjacent activities? Do you do anything for the general? Have you given any lectures to the lay population, for example?
Yeah, I have. What happens is that, like, the Harvard Cancer Center had me come out. They had me come out on a Friday, and I give a scientific lecture to the faculty. And then Saturday they'll typically have a patient-related conference, and they love having me talk about this because here I'm a scientist who is involved in the understanding of Lynch syndrome, and I tell them this is the family that I came from too. This is what people were dying from until we solved the problem. So yeah, I get to do a lot of that. And I'm trying to think of I don't know that I've ever been asked to do that here, but I've been asked to do that at a number of other places.
What what were the great challenges in your first term here at UCSD as you helped build your career and build, gastroenterology? What were the biggest hurdles that you faced, and what were the biggest victories?
Well, the biggest hurdle was that the Department of Medicine went bankrupt, and they were unable to come through with the things that brought me out here. That's it in a nutshell. Um, and when that happens, then everybody tends to, kind of draw the line around them, and they don't want to help other people. I found that kind of hard. We made a couple of good recruitments when I was here. We solved this Lynch syndrome problem in my family when I was here. Um, and it was I made a lot of friendships that were important. I watched John Carruthers, grow and develop, and he succeeded me. First I put him in charge at the VA. He was in charge of the training grant, and then at the VA, and then he succeeded me as the division chief. And also, he had a fellow who we recruited into the internal medicine residency. She was working in a research laboratory up on North Torrey Pines. She had graduated from medical school in Germany. We brought her in, and then she came into the GI fellowship right about the time that I left. And that woman's name is Barbara Young, and she's the incoming dean of the medical school. She was the chairman of medicine at the University of Washington. So there have been a lot of really big success stories that have come out of UCSD. People whose careers really bloomed when they went other places, which is the way it's supposed to work. It's not like we chased them away.
Um, tell me and the folks who are watching this a bit about your family life now. You have a wife, you have kids. Tell us about your family.
Well, so when we went out to the Indian Health Service, we decided to start our family. So we were married. My wife and I were married for 5 years. 4.5 years before we had our first child. So we had a little girl out there who's about to turn 50, by the way. And then she got pregnant again. I mean, we couldn't not get pregnant. That was the problem. I mean, we had a couple of IUD failures. We had every kind of contraceptive failure. But so just as we were leaving New Mexico, she was 8 months pregnant with our second daughter, who was then born in San Francisco. Then we had our third daughter, who was born in San Francisco, who's now on the faculty at UCSD in gastroenterology. Her name is Bridget, and she's an inflammatory bowel disease expert. So anyways, I had three daughters. My wife is a a master at raising daughters. I mean, the girls love her, she loves them, and they've all had their own successful careers. Two of them are in San Francisco. Um, one is involved in teaching and related things like she was in charge of admissions to a private school and so on. The second one had a master's of public health, and she ran women's clinics and did that kind of thing for a while. And then the youngest one is Bridget, who went to medical school at UC. She went to college. She went. They recruited her to Yale as a field hockey star. She was a star field hockey player here in San Diego, and they flew her out to look at the program, and they said, "We think that we might be able to get you in here." And they say, "How good are your grades?" She said, "Well, I'm the valedictorian of my class." And then they said, "Do you have anybody in your family who went here?" He said, "Yeah, my father went to medical school here." Then they realized that they didn't need to fly her out. But anyways, she had a real good time there. Then she went to UC San Francisco, and then she spent the rest of her career since graduating from UC San Francisco down here in San Diego. And we've got 5 grandkids. We get together for the holidays whenever we can. So we swap off Thanksgiving and the Christmas holidays. They'll either go with the in-laws or to come down with us. And a couple times we've had 15 people in the house, all coming down the steps for a Christmas tree, and to see the kids, they get pretty excited about this. So,
What has been given? What has two questions? What got you involved in the? I'll ask this one first. What got you involved in the Emeriti Association, and what have you found in the Emeriti Association that's given you any sense of purpose or sustenance or?
well, because I was gone for so long between, when I left and when I came back, I really felt like I needed some way to reattach with people, and I only knew people from the medical school faculty. I knew very few from the general faculty, which was unfortunate. And then I had have a friend named Roger Sprague. He was chief of medicine at the VA when I was here, and we were good friends. And he was running a book club. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come and join our book club? I think you'll like it." Well, I've loved it. I've been doing that for the last 4 years. But it was largely an attempt to reattach, and the book club was the hook that kind of got me in. But I've had no regrets about this. It was been very good to meet people from other disciplines, and to see what's going on elsewhere, and to go to the faculty club and meet people there. So yeah, it's been a good, largely a social issue was why I did it.
Completely valid. I I joined because I wasn't sure what I was going to do after retirement 8 years ago, and I happened to drop by the Retirement Resource Center where our now retired herself director, Suzanne Chaffee, pulled me in by the neck and said, "You're getting involved." And she, as we all know, she's a force of nature, and
Yep.
therefore, she who must be obeyed. So I've become involved. So I understand there are different hooks for all of us. What do you, what are you doing with your whatever spare time that you have these days? What do you do for pleasure, for joy? What does your life look like in that regard?
Well, my wife says you're not really retired. She goes, "I know that because I'm writing papers. I get asked to review papers all the time. That's a big part of things because not everything that gets written gets published. So I'm reviewing papers. I get asked to write commentaries and that kind of thing. So, at this point in my career, in as much as I'm not running a laboratory, I'm not making new discoveries. The one thing that I can say I've got this is I understand the history of where all this stuff came from. And so I can help, when I give lectures, which happens, 2 or 3 times a year, I go to some place and I can discuss the youngest, the new brilliant scientists who are coming along are largely involved in informatics. And they didn't have to do what I did, which was to go down to the pathology laboratory and get a piece of tissue from a colon. And I said, "I'll take this piece," and they say, "No, you can't have that one, but you can have this one over here." And then I would do microscopic evaluations or biochemical evaluations and the rest of that. Well, these guys who are doing this now don't do that. Somebody else is collecting the tissues and have a repository, which we didn't have access to. And then they take it to a laboratory that does a huge number they'll get millions of data points, DNA sequences and that kind of stuff. And then they'll put it into this program and that program, and the things will pop out. Whereas in the old days, we had to get the tissues ourselves. We had to analyze them. And literally the first paper that I wrote, the statistical analyses, I did something called a chi-square test, and I actually took a textbook of statistics and looked up the statistical significance in the back of the book. I mean, it was really old school. We didn't do anything by computer back then. So, anyways, I get asked to do a lot of these things that will help bridge where we were to where we are now. People want to hear about that kind of thing. So I do that, and then the field of gastroenterology has a number of things. Well, they will post reviews of articles. You don't get credit for writing anything, but you do a commentary on this, and so they're posted. So there are things that keep me busy. I've read since the COVID epidemic. I've read a huge number of books. Half of them with the book club, or maybe a third for the book club, and others. And I really enjoy that because I was never a fast reader, but I never had that much time to read when I was busy, working. But now I can read whatever I want, and I can say no if somebody says we'd like you to write this or do that or review this article. I say no, I'm not. I don't have time for that.
And of course, your daughter has taught you how to play field hockey, I'm sure. So,
I don't know how to swing the darn bat.
What about travel? Any interesting travel? Do you enjoy travel?
My wife refuses to do what do you call them? Those tours. What's the word when you go on a boat across the those guys.
A cruise.
Cruise, yeah. So she will never do that. So
I'm with your wife, by the way.
What's that?
I'm with your wife. You'd never
Okay.
get me on a boat.
So what happens? I jog every morning for an hour and a half.
Wow.
And 3 days a week I go to the Y, and I do this thing called body pump for an hour, and we lift weights and that kind of stuff. And we wouldn't get to do that. And Pat, my wife, is an incredibly fit person, and she's doing 2 and 3 times a day. She's doing yoga or some kind of exercise or whatever. And she says, I'm not going to leave this behind. So
all right.
So we don't. So when we travel, I would say 90% of the time, it's going to be either somebody invited me to give a talk somewhere, or it's to see family.
Great. Seeing family is a wonderful thing.
And they're all, and my siblings all live back in Pennsylvania or New York. So that's where we go. And I've got a whole bunch of cousins back there too.
That's nice. And you can go back in the fall and see some leaves change.
Yes. Yeah. The leaves in upstate New York, as you know, are gorgeous. They're
spectacular.
When I was a little kid, from age 3 to 14, we lived on the banks of the Susquehanna River, which runs from the Catskills, goes through New York into Pennsylvania, and ends up in the Gulf of Delaware. So I don't know, and ends up in a great big gulf. And so we had these maple trees in our front yard with giant, gorgeous leaves. Of course, I'd have to rake them when they'd fall.
Before we end our session, could you tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote?
Yeah, essentially, it's called Cancer Family, like the search for the cause of hereditary cancer. And I just tell a lot of like what I was telling you about what it was like to grow up in my family and how that led to this and that, the discovery of the fact that there was this inherited disease in the family. I didn't know if I had it or what was going to happen to me or my siblings. And then we found the mutation and we published that. And I wrote that in 2014. So we hadn't yet done the work that's all about to be published. That says that before we had the test, almost everybody died. Since we've gotten the test, we can save almost everybody. So that's a nice thing. But essentially, it's a book written for a lay public. It's not scientific. In fact, I didn't write the scientific part well enough because a few people said, I couldn't quite understand how you cloned this mutation. I said, yeah, and I didn't do a good job of that, but we explained it in this more recent paper. Um, but in any event, it was all about that whole thing and about how my life got transformed by recognizing that there was this horrible thing lurking in our genes.
That's great. Well, Rick, thank you for your time today. This has been a delightful conversation, as I expected it would be. And I'm really grateful for, for all of your contributions, certainly as a researcher, as a physician, as a scholar, and as a teacher, and also as a member now of the UCSD Emeriti Association leadership. And it's really lovely to have this edition for our Video Legacy project. So thank you very much. I will see you at the next Emeriti Association Executive Committee meeting, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Okay.